Resuming debate, the honourable member for Scanable Valley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to say it's a pleasure to rise to speak to Bill C-51 if it weren't for the contents of this bill and for the direction that our government is taking us in such a worrisome fashion. Let me preempt my comments by suggesting that and confirming that the primary role of government is to keep its citizenry safe from threats both domestic and foreign. Now, those are threats that can be borne out by groups. It can also be threats to our liberties and our security borne out by a government itself that no longer has the ability to maintain any semblance of balance and understanding of what it is to live in a free and fair democracy. Now, Conservatives were so concerned about privacy and freedoms that they cancelled the long-form census because it was such an intrusion on the privacy and rights of Canadians, yet are now embedding in this bill, C-51, the right of the state to have warrantless seizure and search powers without any oversight from a judge. Take that for a moment. Conservatives didn't want the government knowing how many bathrooms Canadians had in their homes, but now Conservatives say they're going to legitimize and legalize the act of a warrantless search on not only homes, but people's emails and phone conversations in their very private lives. And that there was no extension of power granted of oversight to the public or to any oversight body at all when handing out these extraordinary powers to the spy agency of Canada. Now, they've made no case whatsoever of the need for this bill. They haven't been able to cite an incident in which a terrorist activity took place that, if this bill had been in place, would have been prevented. In fact, there have been a number of arrests in Canada over the last number of years of potential terrorist threats well before they even happened. And yet the Conservatives say they need to hand CSIS these broad powers. Now, let's look if it's not for legitimate security reasons, then what's it for? And one doesn't have to go too far back into the Conservative agenda and history to realize that the Conservatives do have an agenda here. And Mr. Speaker, I neglected at the beginning of my comments to mention I'll be splitting my time with the members from Beaches East York. The Conservatives have time and time again shown who their enemies are. We all recall the famous enemies list. Friends and enemies stakeholders, the Prime Minister's office called it back in 2012. They wanted to compile together, this was a memo from the Prime Minister of Canada's office, asking government officials to compile a list of stakeholders who were friends and stakeholders who were enemies, in their words. Fast forward to the then Natural Resource Minister, now Finance Minister, who, in attacking opponents of his pipeline dreams in northern British Columbia, said that opponents were enemies of the state and foreign-funded radicals. Now take those two comments for what they are. Enemies of the state for opposing an industrial project, a pipeline that is highly controversial and, in fact, opposed by 2/3 of British Columbians. So are those what enemies of the state have become? Anybody who happens to have an opinion, anyone who happens to have the audacity to be against a government's policy or an industrial proposal, which, by the way, threatens our very way of life in northern British Columbia. There are 3 points of this bill that are most worrisome, Mr. Speaker. First of all, that the definition of terrorism is vastly expanded to include things like economic interests and countering government policy. Well, Mr. Speaker, if the net is cast so broad to include anything as a terrorist activity that happens to contravene something that the government of the day wants to push forward, then we have to ask ourselves, what type of country are we living in, and what type of country is imagined by Conservatives? The second point, and this has already been struck down in court from a previous bill trying to counteract money laundering and terrorism, but here the Conservatives go again with warrantless search and seizure. The ability to go in without a warrant and conduct searches is at the foundation of what this democracy and any free and right-thinking democracy stands for. That the state simply can't, without the purview of a judge, without rational and proper discourse, go in and interfere with the private lives of Canadians. Now that's been struck down just recently at the Supreme Court, but here the Conservatives go again, trying it again. And lastly, and this is an important one, that the level of oversight is so weak already that we've heard from commission after commission, looking into the Air India bombing, for an example, that oversight needed to be improved. And what have the Conservatives done? Well, they've expanded powers, but they haven't improved any oversight. Now I fought for years after some tragic events in my riding involving Ian Bush, a young man, when interacting with the RCMP, and he was in a confrontation and was killed. It's fought for years with the Bush family and with many right-thinking British Columbians to bring more public oversight to the RCMP. And Conservatives rallied against this, saying public oversight of our police forces is unnecessary, and that we were somehow demeaning security and police forces by even asking for it. And lo and behold, British Columbia was able to bring in public oversight of the RCMP, as police oversight has been brought in Alberta, in Ontario, and now finally in the United States they're contemplating the very same thing, because with extraordinary power comes extraordinary responsibility, and it is right for the public to ask for some level and measure of oversight. And yet we see here in this bill that CSIS, if the spy agency itself determines itself that it may contravene our charter, that it may break someone's civil liberties by some action that they're undertaking, spying on them, tapping their phone, breaking into their email accounts, if CSIS lawyers determine that that may be happening, then CSIS, under this law, may go to a judge and seek a warrant. Now some would say that's enough for oversight, but the judge never sees them again. So off they go on their merry way, and do they expand their search and investigation of Canadians? Do they go beyond? Well, the judge never knows. The public never knows. Parliament has no oversight capacity, and we implored the government through dozens and dozens of amendments to take on some of these basic and reasonable requests. That 43, I believe, out of the 48 witnesses that appeared before the committee, many of them called by Conservatives, said this bill is flawed and needs major fixes. Many of those witnesses, expert witnesses in matters of security and civil rights, said the bill has to be scrapped entirely. Former Supreme Court judges, former prime ministers, both Liberal and Conservative, called this bill what it is, which is an affront to basic Canadian values. And for me, as somebody who has great faith and pride in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, to see that the impact on those rights and freedoms as proposed by this bill with little to no justification at all is incredibly worrisome. Now, you'd think that with all the terrorist threats, and certainly with all the rhetoric we hear from the Conservatives, that going after money laundering and terrorist financing would have been the first order of a Conservative government. In the last 4 years, we haven't seen any increase in CRA's budget to do just that, to go after money laundering, to go after terrorist financing. Nothing, no increase at all. Where has there been increase in the CRA budget, the Canada Revenue Agency budget? To go after charities, to go after bird watchers, environment groups, First Nations groups, anybody, again, who had the audacity to suggest an opinion that was different from the government, to have the audacity to suggest that they disagreed with some Conservative policy or another. And yet here we are, with a government that claims to have the security interests of Canadians, yet so often and so consistently disregards our civil liberties, our rights and freedoms, the fact that the government can in fact infringe upon the values that Canadians so cherish. Now, Mr. Speaker, I will suggest this. Conservatives have managed to pull off some rare feat coming from the northwest of BC. They've managed to bring gun owners and environment groups, First Nations and loggers, and groups from across the political spectrum in my part of the world to come to a place of agreement in their opposition to this bill. It's a rare feat in politics when you can bring so many different divergent groups together in unity opposing an idea. And that idea is expressed in this bill, which is C-51. An idea is that abhorrent to Canadian values, is contrary to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and is contrary to any sound policy making. If the intention is to protect Canadians, let's protect Canadians from true threats to our security and threats from a government that wishes to abuse their powers. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable